All right, guys, I'm going to be covering the review guide for you. This is review guide number 1. All right, I'm going to be going quickly because you guys have the benefit of pausing and rewinding and rewatching. All right, so the first one is saying to solve using the quadratic formula. Before you can do that, you have to get it into standard form. And let's start by doing that. So we have to add 6x, since we have a negative 6x over there. Add 6x. That cancels, leaving us with 5x squared plus 6x is equal to negative 1. Last step is to add 1 on that side. Whatever you do on one side has to be done on the other. Cancels. 5x squared plus 6x plus 1 is equal to 0. Now we have to identify our A, our B, and our C, so we can plug it into the quadratic formula. A is 5, B is 6, C is 1. All right, it's there. So let's put into our formula, which is right here. Okay. So remember that this negative B right here is the same thing as opposite of B. And so let's plug it in. So let's start by doing what I told you guys to do, which is put your parentheses in place for the stuff that you're going to plug in and then go back and plug it in later. So B squared minus 4AC. Okay, so the opposite, all over to A. And so the opposite of A6 is a negative 6. And then we'll plug everything else in as is. So A is 5, C is 1, and then again A is 5. And so remember I told you guys to do everything that's underneath the radical first and keep it under the radical because we haven't done anything with that just yet. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. And so that leaves us with negative 6 plus or minus. Let me use a different ink color. That is negative 6 plus or minus, and then what we had under the radical was a 16, and then 2 times 5 is 10. Next, we're going to solve what is on the right side of that plus or minus, the square root of 16, because we can take the square root of that. The square root of 16 is 4, so that leaves us with negative 6 plus or minus 4 over 10. Now look, we have two regular numbers on both sides of the plus or minus. That means we can apply the math on that. We have a negative 6 plus 4, and we have a negative 6 minus 4, and that's both over 10. So let's go ahead and do that. We have negative 6 plus 4 over 10, and negative 6 minus 4 over 10. This is equal to negative 2 over 10. And this is equal to a negative 10 over 10. And the last thing to do is to simplify. That simplifies to negative 1 over 5. So that's x is equal to that. And this simplifies to a negative 1. And there's both your answers. X is equal to negative 1/5, and x is equal to negative 1. All right, number 2 is completing the square. Remember, in order to complete the square, A has to be, well, first has to be in standard form, then A has to be no greater than 1 or 1, and then B has to be even. And then you want to isolate both of your terms with x's on them on one side and then your constant on the other. And then you can set it up with our plus blank. And so we have x squared plus 4x plus blank. Remember to add your plus blank. In order to get our 12 on the other side, we have to add 12, and that leaves us with a 12 on this side plus blank. Then we want to divide this by 2. That gives us what to put in our parentheses. That's x plus 2 squared. Remember how we get this blank is we take this number and we square it, but it's always going to stay positive no matter what this is. That's why we have our plus blank there, and that's what's going to fill in these 2 blanks. So 2 squared is 4. And so now you do your 12 plus 4, and that's 16. Now we're solving by square root. So let's change ink color. Square root. That cancels. That leaves us with x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus 4. And then next step would be to subtract 2. That cancels. X is equal to negative 2 plus or minus 4. Again, guys, we have 2 regular numbers on each side. There's no I and there's no radical, so we can do the math on both of those. It's negative 2 plus 4 and negative 2 minus 4. So we have, let's fill in this area, negative 2 plus 4 and negative 2 minus 4. That's equal to 2, and that's equal to negative 6, and you're done. X is equal to negative 6, x is equal to 2. Let's move on to 3 and 4. All right, this is already in standard form. And so we want to go ahead and start factoring. So we have that times that. Is equal to negative 18. And then your b term always goes on the bottom here. That is negative 17. Then I need 2 numbers that multiply to get me here, and combine together, add or subtract, to get me to negative 17. That would be a 18 and a 1. I would need that to be negative 18. So negative 18 plus 1 is negative 17, and negative 18 times 1 is negative 18, so we can proceed. Now we have x minus 18. We have x plus 1. Remember, our last step here, or not really our last step, but our next step is to divide this 3 out since we multiplied by it. So we're going to divide by 3, and see if it simplifies. This does not simplify, so we're going to leave that in place because we want to just go ahead and solve it. And then this does simplify. And simplifies to x minus 6. And so both of these are set equal to 0. So that's equal to 0. And then x plus 1/3 is equal to 0. So we want to go ahead and do the math now. Plus 6, x is equal to 6. And then minus 1/3, x is equal to negative 1/3. All right, now if you did the bottoms up, which we told you before when we're factoring, that would have been taking that 3 up there. You could have also solved it that way. Let me go ahead and show you. So 3x plus 3x plus 1 is equal to 0. And then our math would have been minus 1. That cancels. 3x is equal to negative 1. And then we would divide by 3 and divide by 3, and you'd have the exact same thing. All right, number 4 says solve by square root. When we're doing that, well, first, we know we need to do that because we have a parenthesis squared, and so we need to be thinking solve by square root. We want to get everything away from this parenthesis squared. That includes the 10 and the 2. Let's start with the addition. So that is subtract 10, gone. This side we'd have this left, and on this side we would have, what is that, 14? Alright, so next we want to get this 2 off of there, so we divide that side by 2, divide that side by 2. That cancels, leaving x minus 3 squared is equal to 7. We want to get that square off of there, so we got to take the square root, which cancels that, leaving us with x minus 3 is equal to plus or minus radical 7. Then our last step is to add 3. That cancels, leaving x is equal to 3 plus or minus radical 7. All right, the next ones are pretty easy. You want to find the discriminant, and that's applying the part that's underneath the square root on the quadratic formula, which is b squared minus 4ac without the radical on it. And so first, let's get this into standard form. We just got to get that over onto the side. So we would minus 8x, leaving us with 2x squared minus 8x plus 8 is equal to 0. Now we identify our a, b, and c. A is 2, negative 8, and 8. And now we apply into the formula. So negative 8 squared, 4. Our a is 2, and our c is 8. Then we just punch that all in the calculator. All right, and that is equal to 0. And it's saying, the directions are saying, then state the number and type of solutions. And when it's equal to 0, that means we have one, need my pen, 1 real. So reference your notes, but when it's equal to 0, there's 1 real. When it's equal to any positive number, it is 2 reals. And then when it's equal to a negative number, it's 2 imaginary. Continue on to number 6. It's pretty much the same thing. I mean, it is the same thing. So let's go ahead and do that. So minus 10x, 3x squared minus 10x is equal to 8. I want to subtract 8, 3x squared minus 10x minus 8 is equal to 0. Our a is 3, b is negative 10, and c is negative 8. Now we apply to the formula, which again is right there. We want b squared minus 4ac, negative 10 here. And we got a is 3, and then c is negative 8, and then we punch that in the calculator, which is equal to 196, which means we have a positive number, which means we have 2 reals. All right, let's move on to number 7. I'm not going to do that one because it's just like the rest, but after you've done it, you should have equal to negative 95, and that would be 2 imaginary. All right, I'll do number 8 because that's a little bit different. Let's go ahead and get that in standard form. Remember, standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c. So we minus 2x, minus 2x. That leaves us with 5x squared minus 2x is equal to 0. Now notice we have an ax squared, we have a bx, but there's no constant, so that means there's 0 for c. And so our a is 5, b is negative 2, and c is equal to 0. And so we plug that into our formula, which is b squared minus 4ac. b is negative 2, a is 5, and c is 0. Then we punch all that in the calculator exactly as it appears, and that would be equal to 4, which means we have a discriminant of 4 and 2 reals. Let's move on to the back. All right, number 9, it's saying simplify the following expressions. And so, first thing we ask ourselves is, does that simplify? And it does. And so we'd have a negative 6 plus or minus 2 radical 20. Or not 2 radical 20, but 2 radical 5. And that would still be over 8. And then now we split to simplify further. So we have, remember, this over 8 and then this side over 8. So take what's on each side of the plus or minus and put it over what's on the bottom. So we have negative 6 over 8 plus or minus 2 radical 5 over 8. Then we simplify. Does it simplify? Indeed it does. It simplifies down to negative 3 over 4. And then the next one does simplify. Remember, you're not simplifying what's under the radical, but just what's outside. So 2 over 8 simplifies down to plus or minus, that would be 2 radical 5 over 4. And there's your answer. All right, let's look at the next one. So remember, when you have a negative under the radical, you have to bring that out in front as an I. So let's do that. We got a negative 12 plus or minus I, and then radical 45 all over 3. Now we do the radical 45. Let's see if that simplifies. It does. And so we have negative 12 plus or minus 3i radical 5 all over 3. And then we split and simplify. So that's a negative 12 over 3 plus or minus a 3i radical 5 over 3. That simplifies to negative 4. And then this simplifies to 3 over 3 is just 1, so that's a 1i radical 5. And there's your answer. All right, so let's look at number 11. On number 11, directions here are solve each equation by using the best method. So we're looking here. We notice that there is no b term. When there is no b term and it's just the x squared, we know that we can solve by square root. And so we're solving for x. So we got negative 28 or minus 28. That cancels, leaving us with 2x squared is equal to, what is that, negative 24. Then divide. That leaves us with x squared is equal to negative 12. Then you want to take the square root to get rid of the square. Take the square root. That cancels. Let's go up here. X is equal to plus or minus square root of negative 12. Then we have to bring that out as an I. And so let's do that. As an I, as x is equal to I radical 12. And then we want to see if you can take the square root of 12, if it simplifies, and it does. And so x is equal to 2I radical 3. All right, going on to number 12. So here we see that we have parentheses squared, which means it's another one that we want to solve by taking the square root. So let's get everything away from the parentheses. So we want to add 40, that cancels, leaving us with x squared, or x plus 2 squared is equal to 49. Want to get the square off of there, so we take the square root, that cancels, leaving us with x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus square root of 49. You can take the square root of 49, so that would be x plus 2 is equal to plus or minus 7. Let's move up here. Actually, before we do that, let's just go ahead and apply the math with minus 2 there, minus 2. And that would leave us with x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus 7. Again, you have two regular numbers on each side of the plus or minus, so that's negative 2 plus 7 and negative 2 minus 7. That's equal to, 5? And that's equal to negative 9. So x is equal to negative 9, x is equal to 5. All right, let's look down at number 13. All right, ask yourself, can we factor? Or actually this one, we see that there's a 1 there and an 8 there, which is even, and your constant's already over here, so we could solve this by completing the square. So let's do that. It's already set up perfectly for us, so we can do x squared plus 8x plus blank. Let's get some better spacing. So we have, remember when completing a square, you want each x term on its side, on its own side, and then the constant on the other. In this case, it's already set up for us, so we can just rewrite it as our plus blank plus blank. Remember, we want to divide b by 2. That gives us what we put in our parentheses down here. Square this. It's always going to remain positive when you come up here. So that is 16. Set that equal to 12. Negative 4 plus 16. All right, now we're just solving by square root at this point. So square root, that cancels, leaving us with x plus 4 is equal to plus or minus 2 radical 3. Then we want to subtract 4, that cancels, and that leaves us with x is equal to negative 4 plus or minus 2 radical 3. All right, next is number 14. We want to see if we can factor that. You can put it in PolySolve in your calculator, A, B, and C, and see if you can. If it gives you a whole number or a non-decimal without an I, then you can just solve by factoring. In this case, you can. So negative 5, 4. Our two numbers on their side are going to be 5 and a negative 1. That leaves us with x plus 5, x minus 4 is equal to 0. And essentially, we know we're going to have the opposite of each one of these numbers when we set them to 0 and we do our one step. So we'd have x is equal to negative 5, x is equal to 4. If you didn't know what I did there, I'll do one of them so you can see. X plus 5 equals 0. Then we subtract 5, that cancels, and then x is equal to negative 5. And you would also do that to this to get your answers. Moving along. All right, number 15, you want to ask yourself if you can factor, punch it in the polysolve, see if you can. In this case, you cannot. You also cannot solve by square root. And you also can't solve by completing the square, leaving us with quadratic formula. And so that is opposite of b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. It's already in standard form. And so our a is 5, b is 3, c is 1. And then we set it up. All right, opposite of b is negative 3. 3, a is 5, and then c is 1, a is 5. Now we want to get this value under the radical without applying the radical to it. So we punch just this stuff into the calculator, and it gives us negative 11. So we have negative 3 plus or minus square root or radical of negative 11. And then the bottom 2 times 5 is 10. We got to bring this out as an I. And so we have negative 3 plus or minus I radical 11 over 10. Then you separate negative 3. I mean, you could leave it like this because this doesn't simplify, but if you separate, you'd have negative 3 over 10 plus or minus I radical 11 over 10. So either or. All right, number 16. How do we solve this? We have a 1 there and an even term there, so we solve by completing the square. In order to do that, we have to isolate these two x's on one side so we have to get the constant off. How do we do that? We subtract 10. That cancels, leaving us with x squared minus 2x plus blank is equal to negative 10 plus 2 is negative 8 plus blank. All right, and then to fill in your parentheses, you divide by 2. So that's x minus 1. Take that 1, square it, and that gives you a 1. And put that there. It's equal to negative 8 plus 1 is negative 7. All right, and then we're solving by square root now. That cancels that, leaving us with x minus 1 is equal to plus or minus radical negative 7. That has to come out as an I. And so now we know we have, let's go up here, x minus 1 is equal to plus or minus I radical 7. And then our last step here is to add 1, cancels, x is equal to 1 plus or minus I radical 7. All right, last two. So we want to ask ourselves if we can solve by square root. We cannot. Why not? Because we have an x there. We have a b term. Can we solve by completing square? No, because this is not 1 and that's not even. Can you factor? Let's find out. Let's put it in standard form. Minus 2. That leaves us with 2x squared minus 3x minus 2 is equal to 0. Put it in your polysolve and see if it gives you an answer. If it does, you can factor. In this case, you can. And so you take that times that. It gives you a negative 4. Put your negative 3 there. And so we want a 4 and a 1. Negative 4 plus 1 is negative 3. Negative 4 times 1 is negative 4, so that works. So now we have x minus 4, x plus 1 is equal to 0. We have to divide this 2 back out of there. And so we divide by 2, divide by 2. This simplifies to x minus 2. And this one does not simplify. And so we still have x plus 1/2 is equal to 0. And then we're just taking the opposite signs, right? Or set them both equal to 0 and solve. So we have x is equal to opposite of negative 2 is 2. And then x is equal to opposite of 1/2 is negative 1/2. There you go. Or again, if you didn't understand that, just set them both equal to 0 and solve. I'll do one so you can see. So x plus 1/2 is equal to 0, minus 1/2, minus 1/2. X is equal to minus 1/2. All right, last one is 18. How are we going to solve that? There's no b term, so solve by square root. So let's go ahead and get everything away from x. So minus 63 minus 63. That cancels. We have 2 over 5. X squared is equal to negative 50. Two ways to do this next step. I can either multiply by 5, leaving just 2x squared, or I can just divide by the full 2 over 5 here. I'm just going to multiply. So multiply by 5, that leaves just what's on the top, so that's 2x squared. Multiply that by 5 is equal to negative 250. Then I want to divide by 2. Divide by 2, that cancels. X squared is equal to negative 125. I want to take the square root. Remember, this has to come out as an I. So let's move up here. X is equal to I square root of 125. Does the square root of 125 simplify? It does. So x is equal to 5i radical 5. All set. Watch, learn, play back, and be ready for the test tomorrow.